Welcome back, everybody. It's time again for another episode of Health Talks with Dr. Trent. The one show, maybe the only show that shows you the path towards a healthier life, one conversation at a time. And today, well, it's deja vu all over again, as somebody famous once said. I think it was Yogi Berra. We're talking flashbacks from the 60s and the resurgent interest of psychedelic medicines, of all things. Is that true, Dr. Trent?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am super happy to introduce you guys to Dr. Dan Karlin. He's currently in New York and is the Chief Medical Officer of MindMed. And I believe they're focused in the world of psychedelic medicine. With that,
I'm gonna have things zoom in and zoom out, and we're gonna have psychedelic colors, and so this whole thing. I lived through that. I remember that vividly. That's my era. We're talking about the '60s and into the '70s here, and Dr. Timothy O'Leary and tune in, turn on, and drop out, or whatever all the phrases were. Dr. Karlin, why has this worked its way back into the discussion? I thought that was something we all tried and laughed about and then gave up on here or discredited. Is it back again, and why?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the right question is the why of it. And well, we, obviously are working with LSD, which is exactly as you say, has this storied history that a lot of the positive aspects of the history have been sort of obscured by this idea that these things had to be put away. But, I'd start by saying that part of this new era of psychedelic medicine research and drug development has as much to do with trying to see these things through the lens of science and medicine. And that, what you're talking about from the 60s, of course, there was, we had Timothy Leary from Harvard and other folks who saw these as almost a societal panacea. And what preceded that, though, was quite a bit of research. So in the 40s, 50s, the psychiatric, the medical, the anti-addiction properties of psychedelic drugs were pretty extensively explored. And though we probably wouldn't take research from, say, the 50s and necessarily look at it in the same lens as we look at our current methods and research standards today, incredibly promising data was gathered in that first era of psychedelic research. And yeah, there was a concerted effort to discredit the psychedelic movement. And to some extent, that had a lot to do with the way that these drugs at the time, maybe medicines tomorrow, were seen as potentially being sort of against the dominant hegemonic forces of the United States. And there was this sense that there was societal unrest could be fueled by the drugs. And there are other hypotheses that the directionality was different or whatever else. But I think that through the hard work of some folks who way preceded my entry into the space, the promise of medicines that, as you say, had been purposefully discredited to actually make meaningful differences in people's lives and help them feel and be better has sort of emerged as more important than keeping these things put away. And so that's where we came into it.
So let's define what a psychedelic is. I had many a friend back in the 60s. I went to the University of Michigan, this radical left-wing college at the time in the early 70s and late 60s. And people were experimenting, and that was the counterculture was trying all this stuff here. The silent majority was shocked, and our parents were fearful of it. But it did start as real serious research, government research mostly. In fact, not to throw another discredit at it here, but that came to light later that the CIA and others were dosing people with LSD without, I think they were African Americans. In fact, I think service people and stuff, without their knowledge or without their awareness of what was going on here. All of this came from a serious purpose. Dr. Timothy Leary at Harvard and all these things. And then it soon turned into a cartoon, almost a frightening cartoon. Talk us through that little evolution. When did psychedelics come to be? And these synthetic psychedelics like LSD, how did they come about?
Yeah, and when we talk about this, it's really important that we acknowledge that there's this incredibly long history, probably predating recorded history, of various groups using drugs that have what we could call acute perceptual effects. Drugs that are highly potent, have very distinct and significant effects on cognition, on perception, on thought processes. And so that goes back in various cultures and
Magic mushrooms,
right.
and
Yeah, peyote and
peyote.
mescaline. That predates the modern psychedelic era, even the early modern psychedelic era. So this has been going on for quite some time, and people even postulate things like the development of abstract thinking was related to discovering that certain drugs could disrupt perceptions and thinking. So there's that history, kind of current early modern history of this stuff. 85 years ago, Albert Hofmann in Basel, Switzerland, was looking at ergot derivatives and trying to synthesize novel ergot derivatives. And in the case of LSD, was trying to look at something that affected vascular constriction. So like the way that our veins and arteries change their elasticity in order to accomplish various tasks to get blood around the body. Synthesized LSD, put it on the shelf, and the next step happened 5 years later. Somehow ingested some, either absorbed it through his skin or took a tiny bit, and had a really strong perceptual effect. And some days later, decided that he was going to try this is, medicinal chemistry at the time. This was Sandoz, now part of Novartis.
Right.
And did what medicinal chemists did at the time, which was to take some.
Try it, see what happens.
I don't know what we do anymore. But, and so he took what for most novel drugs would be a really small dose. He took 250 micrograms, so a quarter of 1 milligram. Now, just for reference for folks who haven't been following along, we're currently doing a phase 2B dose range finding study for LSD in the treatment of generalized anxiety disorder, which has a placebo arm and then 4 dose arms. The highest dose arm that we're using LSD to treat GAD with is 200 micrograms. So in thinking he took a very small dose, he actually took a rather significant dose and ended up biking home. And that's now become what's called Bicycle Day. It had a very significant perceptual effect, and noticed a ton of things, had some scary bits to it, but mostly he was entirely impressed with the remarkable significance of the experience that he had. And the change in his thinking was so profound that he pretty quickly realized he was on to something unusual here. And subsequently, through the 40s and 50s, as I said before, LSD was used by psychiatrists and by sort of proto-neurobiologists to treat a lot of different things, everything from depression to what was then alcoholism or alcohol use disorder today. And across a hugely wide range of conditions, it was found that having even a single LSD experience could create lasting change.
Wow.
And so that then, of course, became what you were describing, the sort of counterculture and the use of these drugs for
take a trip, tune in, turn on, drop out. So,
and whether you said the CIA unwittingly dosing civilians, I've heard stories of them dosing one another by surprise. So that this very powerful drug captivated the thinking and imagination of a hugely wide range of people, some of whom had better motives than others, let's say. And ultimately what that led to was prohibition, that psychedelic drugs were made Schedule 1 substances when the DEA came into being.
As bad as it can be, Schedule 1, this is right up there, heroin.
No accepted, Schedule 1, it just means no accepted medical use, right? And so drugs like cocaine have accepted medical uses, so they're not on Schedule 1. But the psychedelics for a long time have been, and they are today. We are able to do research on them through licensing, essentially with, applications licensing and careful controls of drug supply, where the DEA has now given us and others permission to do research with these Schedule 1 drugs. All of our sites need to have Schedule 1 licenses. And what we've been seeing over the last decade or so is this renewed interest in the positive or potential positive effects of these drugs now being used as medicine.
And when did the DEA come into being, and when did Congress start outlawing drugs or banning drugs? It was like the 70s, it wasn't the 60s.
At least early 70s, right? And the unusual thing about an agency like DEA is ordinarily when you create a law enforcement agency, you don't give them also rulemaking power. And so the story of
we're going to put you in charge with enforcement. And by the way, you can also decide what to enforce, right?
Yeah, it's unusual for sure. And when you hear, again, and I'm no historian and certainly no expert on that era, but when you hear stories about the intention of the founding of the DEA and what it became, they seem divergent. And that the intention wasn't necessarily to create a prohibition state, but rather to regulate access and to not to prevent research, but even to enable research. And that's our experience today, is that while there are administrative hurdles and certainly, things that can be timely and potentially expensive to get through to work with these drugs, that the reality is we are able to do research today. We're able to do high quality pharmaceutical research. So when we look at the drugs work, we also have a program with the right enantiomer of MDMA. So another Schedule 1 drug that is finding new uses, and our MDMA program looks a little different than other MDMA programs. We can talk about that too. But that, we don't conceive of ourselves as a psychedelics company, despite the fact that the drugs we're using are classified that way to some extent. Now, it's important when we talk about this, just, from a nomenclature perspective, psychedelics in this resurgence has come to represent, that word has come to represent what we would actually consider a few different classes of drugs. So ketamine, which has long been approved as an anesthetic, and recently S-ketamine, the left enantiomer of ketamine, has been approved as an antidepressant, gets lumped with psychedelics, where it's not technically a psychedelic. It's a dissociative anesthetic and probably works purely by neurobiology. There are other drugs that are on the sort of, like MDMA that I mentioned, not technically a psychedelic, but definitely seems to be useful in enabling psychotherapy. And in our program, we're looking at lower doses of MDMA potentially being able to, the right enantiomer of MDMA, being able to help folks with autism spectrum disorder. And then in the middle, there's LSD and psilocybin and these classic psychedelics that have their very distinct perceptual effects. So it is important to sort of, even in the conversation, think about this somewhat more zoomed in a little bit. And so we see ourselves very much as a biotech, as a drug company who happens to be working with these drugs with this rich history and this high likelihood of doing what we think they're likely to do.
So given the background, that's why I wanted to go through this, where it suddenly was fascinating. Psychedelics themselves, psychedelic compounds, peyote and mushrooms, all those things have been around since the dawn of civilization. But it was the synthetic stuff, LSD specifically, that seemed to at one time become sort of the darling of psychiatrists and celebrities, and then the demon that had to be put back in the bottle. What made you a respected psychiatrist? You're living born and raised, you said, on the Upper West Side in Manhattan here. What made you risk opening the genie's bottle again here? Why were you drawn to even look into this stuff here?
Yeah, I mean, what a good question. And I will say it was with some trepidation that I walked into this world. I'm relatively new to this. It's only been a couple of years that I've been with MindMed. I had a tech company, a health tech company that ended up being acquired by MindMed, which is how I came into this role. And I'm far from the bravest. By the time I got into this world, many more respected psychiatrists, that really respected past presidents of the APA, chairs of major academic departments, had already cast their lot behind some of the companies working in this space. So for me to claim any sort of valor here would be absolutely incorrect. That I was more or less walking in the footsteps of folks who trained me and were expressing confidence in what these drugs could do. But that's my personal why. I think the more important why is what the hell's happening in the world that we think we need these drugs.
Yeah. Well, we'll go into that in 1 second. I just want to I'm just fascinated, having lived through that. I remember vividly, just to give you some color or flavor to this stuff here. When I was in high school, you could tell who the cool kids were because they not only knew what LSD was and maybe had tried it, they could tell you what it stood for. What is LSD? Something, lysergic, something. I used to be able to say.
Diethylamine, yeah. Like lysergide is the easier way. Is the easier way to go.
But what is the compound? What is it that gives it its psychedelic properties? Is it derivative of some plant-based thing, or is it something brand new that nobody had ever seen before?
Both. So the effort to develop it was looking at ergots, usually known as the rye fungus. And there's some really interesting history about ergot-based psychosis. So that again, and this gets into sort of speculative history, but some of these mass hysterias that have been described through history are thought to maybe be because of contaminated flour supply or bakeries becoming contaminated. There's some hypotheses that at times it's even done on purpose. So the starting compound is fungus, not to manufacture modern LSD, but that's what Hoffman was working with. And that's what he was trying to develop synthetic analogs to. LSD itself totally novel compound when he first synthesized it. So it was a heretofore unknown compound that was synthesized based on an attempt to get something that was structurally similar to these ergots. So why is it psychedelic is an answerable question. And that we know that there is what's called 5-HT2A. So it's a serotonin receptor. Serotonin system, really complicated, a lot of different subtypes. This is one specific subtype. And what we do know about all classic psychedelics is if you block the 5-HT2A, the serotonin 2A receptor, you don't get the perceptual effects from the drug. And so that acute change that folks experience, the trip, right, is driven by very strong binding, but LSD particularly strong binding to the 5-HT2A receptor. Now, what we don't know, and what there's been now a ton of ink being spilled in the scientific literature, is what drives the change that persists beyond the trip. And this is where it gets, I think, very interesting and fun. Lots of neurobiological hypotheses are being proposed these days based on really good science. And there is now a divide of sorts in the field between folks who say that the lasting change, the lasting improvement in multiple neurotic illnesses, depression, anxiety, and I talked about addiction a little bit, that lasting change is psychologically driven. That something that one experiences during the acute perceptual change leads to lasting change. There's another camp that says, no. We can take the trip out entirely. You don't need the perceptual change because other things neurobiologically are happening that lead to persistent improvement, persistent change. And of course, the answer in neuroscience and in most of biology is probably it's not one or the other, probably components of both, different for different people, different for different diseases. But it's a really exciting area of research. And, paper just a couple of weeks ago that looked at what they call the opening of critical periods through the use of psychedelic drugs, and demonstrated that length of critical period opening, so a period of time when the brain is more able to be plastic and change and readapt, is longer, the longer the duration of the perceptual changes. So there's this is a nascent field. And we can talk about neuroscience and how it relates to psychiatry and this sort of thing too. It's one of my major interests, but really neat areas of exploration right now.
So Dr. Trin, we've taken us down this kind of quick history, down memory lane here. My memories of psychedelics being the darling of the counterculture and the darling of celebrities, and then the demon of society. Nobody summarized it better than Dr. Timothy O'Leary, who went from, I believe, a very respected Harvard, I don't know if he taught at Harvard or just went to school at Harvard, but an esteemed psychologist who then became the epitome of somebody who's just lost his mind and lost all his credentials because he's advocating this so openly and so fluently. What do you think, Dr. Trin? What is the value of the trip? Why are so many people saying that this psychedelic experience can open doors and not just lead to a different perceptual understanding of things, but maybe even have some medicinal value to it?
So this is just my perception
Right.
and how I understand it. The use of psychedelics allow brain cells that have never spoken before, that have never connected, to have the opportunity to perhaps connect. And maybe that's why in a trip, right, colors change, size change,
Shapes change.
it's change.
We're fascinated with this idea. You like to play in the metaverse, Dr. Trin, and we're fascinated in the metaverse and other things with, with virtual reality or augmented reality, where things, you put on some goggles and things can appear out of nowhere in front of you, or that the reality takes you into some place, you're in a whole different world. That seems to be the psychedelic experience. It takes you in some place that you've never can imagine.
And so the idea behind this is, if we want to look for therapeutic potential, let's say someone who has been depressed or who have been anxious, and they've been depressed and anxious for a very long time. There are certain triggers that takes them down depression lane. There are certain triggers that take them down anxiety lane, right? And they relive that. And these triggers and the lanes they walk through are essentially just brain cell connections that have been connected over and over and over for a very long time. When you use psychedelic, the idea is that maybe we can create some new connections so that you can look at these same circumstances at a different angle. with a different meaning that will maybe make you less anxious or depressed or things of that sort. That's kind of my high level view of it. Am I going down the right path, Dan?
Well, I think that was that the metaphor that we use in our phase 2B trial is like a fresh coat of snow. That the previous paths can be reworn, relived. And it's interesting that as you're describing it, your description almost verges toward what we might call psychodynamic psychotherapy's mechanism, right? Which is that, when you think about repression as a defense mechanism, it's usually not that someone has completely forgotten something. It's that they see it with a particular explanatory mechanism wrapped around it. And that explanatory mechanism of something in the past has been brought forward, maybe inappropriately to the future and misapplied to current situations. And so getting outside of those thought pathways that you lived in, maybe your whole life, the whole part of your life that you can remember, your whole life with an autobiographical history attached to it. And so what's really cool, and this goes back to my mechanism comment before, is during the psychedelic experience, during the trip, as it were, people see themselves through different lenses, right? They experience themselves without the same filters, without the same explanatory mechanisms, and maybe with whole new explanatory mechanisms, whole new sense of self. So that accounts maybe for the psychological mechanism, if that's it. And then what you're describing is the neurobiological mechanism could also do that, right? Which is that it allows during the acute experience, the sort of routine brain connections just aren't happening the same way. So everything seems and feels different. And then maybe the persistent effect is this critical period idea, right? That neuroplasticity, that can be positive. Now, of course, neuroplasticity can go both directions, but that the opportunity for positive neuroplasticity for establishing new connections is particularly enhanced in the weeks or months following an experience. So this is the very cool thing, is those two, the psychological and the neurobiological, might be quite symbiotic with one another.
So let me again just share my own sort of perspective on this. I grew up at the heyday of, Haight-Ashbury and psychedelics and all this stuff we're talking about. And I remember celebrity stories splashed about from one extreme to the other. The Beatles, of course, famously, when they dropped acid or somebody dropped it on them. I'm not sure they knowingly took it the first time. I'm not sure that they weren't just, slipped a dose of LSD on some party or something. But they became advocates of taking this trip. The Magical Mystery Tour, had that kind of LSD imagery and everything we associate with. And when they did it, the Beatles did it, everybody did. I remember reading just recently, Cary Grant. Anybody under my age probably won't remember Cary Grant, but was there a bigger star in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s than Cary Grant? The epitome of the perfect male, the very respected kind of male. And in his autobiography years later, they're doing a movie about him again. Here's his daughter's bringing something back of how he reinvented himself and remade himself from being this very poor upbringing Archie Leach to this famous suave movie star. And he credits LSD. He took LSD a lot to try and give him a new perspective and get away from this horrible, abusive, impoverished childhood and to turn him into something else here. And then the most famous story I always heard was Carlos Santana at Woodstock taking LSD before he goes on stage. And according to what he'd recanted for years later, this idea that his guitar was suddenly a snake. And as he was trying to hold on to the long neck of the guitar, it was a long snake that was trying to bite him. So he was trying to play this thing and control a snake. Those stories both fascinated and frightened us. And me included. I was pretty open and liberal and tried different things, but never psychedelics, because I was afraid of not only that frightening bad trip, that frightening experience that might be overwhelming, but the lasting effects. Is there a lasting effect to these trips? Does it alter your brain chemistry permanently or just temporarily?
I mean, so that's this sort of question we're trying to answer. And there doesn't seem to be the long-term negative effects that folks have described about psychedelics don't seem to come out in any of the research anyone's doing. So there's
flashbacks. We were kidding about
people with flashbacks. There's something in the DSM called hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. We don't really see that in the way with the drugs we're using in the studies we're doing. So these long-term negative effects, who knows, right? contaminated drug supply, very heavy use over a long time, polysubstance use, the lifestyle that goes with using lots of drugs a lot of the time. But those long-term negative things don't seem to be there. The other thing we're not seeing in the trials is much in the way of bad trips. That it turns out if you know what you're getting, you've gone through an informed consent process. There are two folks in the room with you who are not using drugs at all and who are just there to help you get through it and to help you feel safe during. The folks mostly are able to take pretty high doses of LSD in our trial and do well. They go into an experience. They may have an emotional experience. They may have even a challenging experience, but that if they need a break, they can chat with the folks who are in there in the room with them. They can have a snack. They can go to the bathroom. Being slipped a dose of LSD in public and not expecting that can lead to some really unpleasant things.
Yeah.
Whereas being in a comfortable but still professional medical setting and taking something you knew you were going to get, that you knew what to expect with, and I think this is extra important, that's for the purpose of having both an experience and a lasting change in something that bothers you. In our case, it's anxiety, right? So that intention seems to matter a ton too, which, folks who go into an experience with psychedelics to sort of reify their current way of seeing the world and their current ego and all these sorts of things can probably find that in the experience as well. But when people do it in these settings to be and feel better, sure seems like that's what happens.
So, Dr. Trin, you said something, you said very elegantly and eloquently, describe this trip as a path, and then related it to neural pathways, firing up neural pathways that maybe have never fired up before here. And that gives you a different perception, a different experience. Your brain sees and experiences things it's never experienced before. And we're both intrigued about that and we're frightened by that. At least my generation was. But the things you're trying to deal with, aren't they sort of psychedelic experiences? Anxiety, depression, psychoses? I mean, isn't your brain giving false signals? Everything's crazy. The world's going to hell. I remember I went through a very depressive experience years ago, and I thought, how can my brain be telling me something so wrong? How can the brain you rely on your brain to do so many things, to figure it out, to logically figure things out. And when the brain isn't functioning right and is sending you false, almost psychedelic experiences, misperceptions, isn't that sort of like what this does too? It's just another way to, I don't know, it seems like another way to treat what is already misfunctioning of the brain here,
Absolutely. Not everything our brain tells us is true. Right? Think about the phobias in life.
Yes, right, exactly.
Arachnophobia, the phobia of heights, right? Not everything our brain tells us matches with reality, but it's it's what our brain tells us, and it's usually
it feels real. We react to it as if it is real. I get phobias on a plane. I've got to get off the plane. I know it's not real, but it feels like it's real. I sweat, my heart races, all these things.
Absolutely. And to be able to address it in a safe environment, right, in a medically monitored environment is what makes the difference versus using it in the street, and be able to evaluate side effects, to evaluate results over time. This is why it's coming back. I don't know if you've seen Netflix's documentary, right? How to Change Your Mind.
No.
Great documentary. It's called How to Change Your Mind. And it goes through, each episode goes through a specific, you got magic mushroom, you got LSD, and it's amazing in that it's bringing back this awareness of something that's been suppressed, I would say, for a very long time.
So where is it going? We've talked about where it's been, why it's sort of got put away on a shelf, put under lock and key, really, and why there's been an interest to sort of revive this and relook at it and re-experiment with it. Where are we going with this? I'm seeing various state legislations toying with the idea of opening the door to using this stuff again here. There's certainly a bunch of companies out there experimenting with it. One of my other show hosts, I won't name him because I don't know if he wants to be named, but rather serious conservative business type, went on an paid and went somewhere in South America to try ayahuasca, another natural hallucinogen that's not legal here in the United States here. And he just swore, he said it was a magical mystery tour. It was a magical experience. Yeah, he saw weird things, but he claims opened his mind to things that he had never experienced or thought of before. And he walked away thinking it was a positive experience. Are we headed back to like where cannabis was years ago? Cannabis was similarly demonized. Are we opening the door to a more even-handed look at these things, or does the word psychedelic still, scare people?
You want that one?
I'll let Dr. Karlin. You're in the
Oh,
midst of this
yours.
here.
Oh,
Yeah.
I can tell you the world that I'm working toward,
All right.
and legalization efforts and things like that. You look at the cannabis. Cannabis got legalized initially as a medicine, but not because people did trials where it helped with medical condition, but because state legislatures declared it a medicine.
Right.
And that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is to research LSD as we would any other psych drug, albeit a psych drug that has an incredibly rich history with very promising data, and one where it seems like a single dose can have both almost immediate, very profound, and durable efficacy. And so the world that I'm working toward, and again, there's a lot of other forces in the world that aren't me and that aren't MindMed, is a world where someone who has an anxiety disorder can go see a psychiatrist, and one of the options that will be on the table for them, supported by their insurance, mind you, like if we just enable folks who can afford to go get it anyway to get tomorrow, right, we're not doing the right thing. The psychiatrist can talk to that patient or a psychiatric nurse practitioner and discuss options, and that one of those options could be an LSD session that would probably be done in a therapist's office, monitored by a therapist with some special training and experience doing this. And that person would then have the drug prescribed. They'd go to the place where the session was going to be. It could be a specialized center. Some of those have been popping up around esketamine, and they have that experience. And then they follow up with their psychiatrist to see how they're doing over time. And then maybe that session needs to be repeated once a quarter for a few quarters. And the highest optimism I have for MM120 or LSD is that over time, with repeat treatments, people find that they don't need to keep repeating the treatment because the thing that was bothering them that caused them to go in and get help in the first place has gotten better.
Are we trying to synthesize new psychedelics, or are we simply relying on the ones we already have? You mentioned M something. I never heard of that.
Yeah.
Are there new psychedelics being developed or by big drug companies, by companies like yours, or are we simply trying to take another look at what was already created before?
Both. I mean, the neat thing is we can do both. And so big pharma is dipping their toe in the water a bit. They have not leapt in yet, but there's been some investment and some collaborations that big pharma companies have entered into. But companies like mine, and there are many right now because there was this sort of explosion of interest, are doing both. And so the highest likelihood of success for a drug development paradigm right now using one of these drugs is to use an existing drug that has a body of evidence that precedes its current use, that's strongly suggestive of efficacy. MM120 is our project code name essentially for the LSD development program. So it's just a pharmaceutically optimized LSD manufactured under very controlled circumstances, the same way any other drug would be. And then following that, psilocybin's being developed, LSD is being developed, DMT is being developed, a bunch of the classic psychedelics. And then behind that, there's an effort to develop a pipeline of drugs that have characteristics that are in some ways similar to the classic psychedelics and in other ways different. And that the difference might be less or no perceptual effect acutely. So there's certainly folks thinking that they can harness elements of the efficacy without the trip. The open question as to whether those things will work in people. So they're showing promising signals in animal models, but animal models of psychiatric illness don't translate particularly well. There are other folks working on drugs that do in fact have the perceptual change, but maybe have different characteristics, shorter or longer, more intense, less intense. So there's a lot of both preclinical research happening and then clinical research happening. But the nice thing about starting with a classic psychedelic like LSD is that we're able to move that through trials relatively rapidly compared to a totally novel compound. So if you synthesize something completely new, even if it is similar to an existing compound, there's a whole preclinical POX package that needs to happen. And essentially what we would call investigational new drug enabling activities that you have to be relatively assured of elements of safety before you can give a novel chemical to human volunteers.
What Dr. Trin does for a living, and one of the many things he does for a living, clinical trials, experimenting with stuff under controlled circumstance to see volunteers, to see what happens, that along with a placebo, I guess, in most cases, to see and to track what happens in small groups of people and see if there are any bad side effects or health complications. What do you think, Dr. Trin? I leave it to you to bring on somebody to talk about a serious discussion about psychedelics. I'm sure your audience, like me, a lot of them are older people. We remember the hype and hysteria around psychedelics. I never thought I'd live to see them be treated seriously ever again. Never. I thought that was a once in my lifetime phenomenon, that once it was killed or demonized or put back in the shelf, I don't think anybody was ever going to open it up and look at it seriously again. But here we
And
are.
here it is. Here it is.
Right.
Going through clinical trials, FDA guided and all that. And it's amazing. Wonder what it's like to be a mice on a trip.
I'm going to say, how would you know that he's seeing his arm as a snake? How would you know that he's having perceptual difficulties?
Big cheese.
I mean, boy, does that open the door to some interesting questions about consciousness, right?
Yeah.
But this is the problem with animal models, is you can't really ask a mouse how he's feeling.
Yeah. What he's seeing.
What he's seeing. The surrogate for psychedelic-like experiences in animal models is what we call head twitch. So that there's this head twitch response that you see in, say, mice who are treated with classical psychedelics. So as folks are trying to develop psychedelics without the trip, they look for the elimination of, there not being a head twitch response to the drug. But the animal models for anxiety and depression are the best we can do with animals who aren't really able to communicate with us. So there are things like, for depression, there's something called the forced swim test, where you look at how long a mouse will swim before giving up, essentially. For anxiety, there's something called an elevated plus maze, where there is a plus-shaped, it's not really much of a maze, right? But a plus-shaped animal habitat where some arms have opaque floors and other arms have transparent floors. And how much time the mouse spends exploring the transparent floor is a surrogate for a lack of anxiety. So, these things, they're useful to some extent, but this is why psychiatric drug development has been so hard, is because you don't really know if you're going to help people until you test in people.
Yeah. And that, again, we have all these anecdotal stories, famous celebrities, famous people, 60s, 70s, experimenting with this, swearing by it, and then the backlash and the bad trips and the flashbacks. So I'm having a flashback, man, from the 60s here. Who's knocking at the door? It's the 60s coming back again here. All that kind of imagery, I think, I'll say it again, it fascinated and it frightened us. Are you seeing that kind of, either of those reactions? Are people overly fascinated or overly frightened by it? Or are you just studying it like any other psychiatric drug or treatment?
I will say, in the world, there are certainly people who are both overly fascinated and overly frightened.
Right.
And we're, as best we're able, trying to be an antidote to both of those.
Right.
As much as possible to say, yes, acknowledge the history, acknowledge the precedent data, let some of that history and some of those data guide us, and then research like any other drug as much as possible. And you can't entirely, again, people are having profound perceptual experience. They see that that's part of taking the drug. And so that is unusual in modern pharmaceutical development. We don't have a lot of pharmaceuticals that cause such acute perceptual changes, but we do have drugs that cause, perceptual changes. We have anesthetics that make people go very deeply to sleep. We have painkillers that cause people to have really changed perception of bodily and even
your body still hurts. You just don't feel it anymore here.
Or you attend less to it. I mean, different pain medicines work via different mechanisms, for sure. Where possible, it's drawing those lines to say, yes, a bit unusual, but maybe not as unusual as it might seem.
So let's address, as we're coming to the end here, let's address the question that you opened the door to and I quickly shut. Why do we suddenly want these things? Why do we suddenly think we need them? My late mother used to say before she died, her favorite joke was, I think the whole world is having a nervous breakdown. She'd see all the insanity going on and we'd just shake our heads all the time. School shootings, rise in violence and hate, fake news, all this anger and stuff flowing. Is the time right? Are we having a collective nervous breakdown? Is our mental state challenged more today than ever before? Or is that just, again, a good story that runs through media? What do you think? Where are
Well,
we?
life expectancy is as long as it's ever been, and it, with some little dips along the way, it pretty much goes that direction. Each day is kind of the safest day to be a human for the majority of humans.
Right.
Yet we live in an era of wildly increasing inequality,
Yeah.
of massive just quality of life differences. We're bombarded with messages of danger.
Yes.
Right? Our brains are finely tuned danger detectors because they had to be when there was more physical danger in our world. And that stick might look like a snake when you first see it, because better to mistake a stick for a snake than a snake for a stick.
Right.
And so we are both in ostensibly the safest world we've ever been in, but in a world that is just increasingly psychiatrically challenging. And
people look at the people are, and I'm not just going to say on the right, but on the left too, are just thinking the world is coming to an end. That we are at Armageddon is right around the corner here.
And we can't agree on anything. We can't even agree on reality between two sides of the political spectrum. And so I think that and who's coming to help, right? I mean, the psychiatry, which used to do extensive psychotherapy based on breaking down defense mechanisms and getting into to making your unconscious thoughts conscious, and psychiatry has been largely relegated to prescribing SRIs, and psychotherapy has been handed off to folks with much less training and often less experience. And who's coming to help? I think there's a general sense of unease.
In fact,
describing.
In fact, there are people profiting from it. I don't want to. My late father, his reaction to everything was, he just thought everything came down to money. Why, we're good Irish Catholics. Why doesn't the church want to have priests marry? It's money. Why are people fighting this? It's money. Somebody's profiting from it or whatever. Somebody's driving. And certainly there is a whole fear industry. Turn on cable news, whether it's left or right, MSNBC or Fox News. There are people preaching this and preying upon, ramping this fear up. And so people literally are, it seems wild, but they're embracing conspiracy theories. They're embracing the wildest ideas and acting as if they're real, and not just voting, but fighting and arming themselves and fleeing and all, like there's a huge, huge existential threat to society right now. And then all the scientists aren't helping, climate change and coronavirus and everything else. We're just bombarded by fear and anxiety here. It seems like more than I can ever remember in my lifetime here.
And so with that as the backdrop, the timing seems obvious to me. And what better to be than an anti-fear company, right? A company that's actually trying to bring something forward that is an antidote to anxiety and gives people, in our trial, I said 5-arm trial, and some folks are getting placebo, some folks are getting a pretty low dose. How often though do you get to just be off your phone for a day? So even the experience of participating in the trial, even if you don't get the drug, I think gives folks a chance to be contemplative and to consider in their own way their life from something of a different vantage. And if these drugs work via the psychological mechanism, or some part of them does, then it's an opportunity to contemplate one's existence through a different lens. And if they work via neurobiology, then, and which is probably also something they do, then it's a chance to have your brain be a little more adapted to the world you live in and feel a little bit better about it.
And that was the one, I think, positive aspect of the whole drug culture, the whole counterculture, the whole hippie movement, was that it made people more contemplative. It made them contemplate their life. Gaze at your belly button was the joke or something. I'm just going to gaze at my navel all day. But it encouraged people, like the Beatles did and other things, to go and find spiritual guides, to go to India, go to the farthest lengths of the world to try and find a guru. But it was all about trying to get to know yourself better. And I think that still has persisted. I think we could use a little of that now because we've lost touch with reality in many ways. I mean,
success or failure starts in the mind.
Yeah, right.
It all starts in the mind. And so it's amazing. I love that you call it an anti-fear company.
Yeah.
And you're right. We live in fear.
We're flooded with fear. Every day I turn on social medias where they prey upon us because fear drives a response more than, we used to say politicians mourning in America and positive John Kennedy and all this kind of aspirational politics has kind of gone out the door. Now it's all fear-based. The end of the world is coming and only I can save you. And then social media is all ramped up about fear. If you see something, then you tweet it and you go look at 4 more and you share it and everything. Do we share the positive stories as well as we share the frightening stories? I don't think so. Fear sells. Fear works. Fear's a motivator. Well,
when your attention is monetized, the easiest way to catch attention is fear.
Yeah.
And that's very much alive and well in our world. But I think the ultimate message and the excitement, the folks who are really excited about the work that we and others are doing, I think it's because they see this as potentially something that could really make a difference in people's lives and in their own, in many cases. So the power of these, once demonized drugs as medicine is that for a lot of folks, it feels like someone's finally coming to help.
So in a weird way, Timothy Leary's admonition to turn on, to try it, to tune in to this new frequency, see something different, and drop out, not just drop out of society, drop out of this fear cycle that we're consumed with and caught up with. Social media, politics, news, everything, all these cycles are just driving fear, fear, fear. Maybe we should drop out of that fear cycle for a while. Maybe it wasn't so crazy as it sounds. Maybe that admonition is finally coming to happen here. What do you think, guys? Is it time to tune in, turn on, and drop out of this fear cycle?
What happened with that was a bit too much zealousness about the drugs. And what if these are just another drug that can help some folks?
Yeah.
And I think that's the line that we're trying real hard to walk, is that it doesn't need to be a faith-based element. It doesn't need to be a religion. It doesn't need to be an entire lifestyle that orients around your drugs. It's much more to us, just like another, like your glasses,
Right.
You don't need a religion.
Well,
glasses.
well spoken, because Dr. Trin and I talk about this all the time. Don't we all just want a pill to make life better? Haven't we all been promised a panacea, whether it was the antidepressants that were passed out like candy, and now it's the opioids that are passed out like candy, and all the crisis that came. At the end of the day, we're looking for just a magic pill to make it all better. And this is not a magic pill. It's just a tool.
Wait, if this works by magic, I got bigger troubles.
Well, it's all magical to me. What do you think, Dr. Trin? Take us out. What a door you opened up, Alice in Wonderland here. Are we ready to go down the rabbit hole here? I don't know.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much, Dan. Dr. Dan Karlin, Chief Medical Officer, MindMed, the anti-fear company. Love it.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on, and come back sometime and give us an update.
We'll have trial readout by end of year, so we'll have some data to share. So I'd love to come back. This was super fun.
And hang on after it's over. Don't hang up, because I'm gonna I'm gonna use another 60s term. I'm gonna turn you on to another show that I think would be fascinating. Would love to have
awesome.
you on as well here.
Take care, guys.
Cool stuff here. All right.
All right.
Well, there you have it. If that's not a fascinating look at the world of health through a different lens, I don't know what is. Come back. We got a lot more here on Health Talks as we stream live from our studios here at the University of California, Irvine's Beale Applied Innovation Center.